and welcome to another writing video. My previous video on writing a book with no experience was very popular with you guys, so I am going to make a follow-up video, and this video is going to be about what I would do differently now that I have 1.5 years of writing experience under my belt. Because I'm writing a book with no experience, I've made a lot of mistakes. I've definitely learned from them, and I wanted to share that learning with you. And just for a recap, when I say I have no prior writing experience, I mean I didn't get a degree in anything writing related. My job has never been in anything writing related, and I've never taken a writing class, and I didn't write growing up. This is something that I only started a few years ago, and it has been quite the adventure. The first thing I wish I had done differently was start a writing practice. This was probably one of my biggest regrets in this whole writing process so far, was not starting a writing practice long before I started writing my book. If you're not familiar, a writing practice is just sitting down and writing every day or most days of the week and just making your writing better over time through practice. You can use prompts on Google. That's what I used a lot of the time. You could journal, you could do your own writing prompts, you could write a scene that you have in mind. It's basically just writing for practice. That's really all it is. And I did not start doing this until 1 to 2 weeks before I started writing my first draft. And that was a huge mistake because when I started writing, it was really, really hard. I had a hard time figuring out how to form sentences, what information to include in sentences and paragraphs, how to structure my sentences and paragraphs so it flowed well. Obviously, I can write a sentence, but the craft of writing was something I had no experience in, and because I didn't practice, when I sat down to write my first draft, it was so bad, and I got so discouraged because my writing was so poor and I knew it. But as I struggled through the first draft and now drafts 2 and 3, writing really isn't hard for me anymore. I mean, of course, I still have a lot of technical things I need to improve on, but in general, when I sit down to write a chapter, I don't get stuck. I'm not confused about how to write something. I just sit down and do it, and that's because I've been writing for over a year. I've got a lot of experience. I've learned things over time that have improved my writing, and I just think back about what if I had started a writing practice so much earlier than I did, how much better my writing would be today. And then also, I would have made probably a lot more progress on draft 1 because I was so discouraged and so unsure about writing. It definitely took longer to write in the beginning. And if I had had a writing practice where I had gained experience, sitting down to write the first draft would have gone a lot more smoothly. I would have made a lot more progress over the course of these last 3 drafts. For those not familiar with my story, I had the idea to write a book 1.5 years before I started writing. And that means if I had started a writing practice 1.5 years before I started writing, I can't imagine what my writing capabilities would be today. Sadly, I did not do that. I have 2 big regrets. That's one of them, is that I should have started a writing practice. The next thing I wish I had done differently kind of coincides with starting a writing practice, and that is creating a writing routine. So a writing routine is basically setting up a set time every day and building writing time into your schedule. I did not do this until about 2 or 3 months into draft 1. Setting up a writing routine was probably one of my biggest game changers in terms of my writing process. When I started writing, I was basically fitting it in whenever I had time, and I think like many of us, when you leave something for when you have time, that is usually never. And the result was I was only working on my book on the weekends and only getting a few hundred or 1,000 words over the course of a week. I was making very little progress on my novel, and I got really, really frustrated with that. And when I incorporated a writing routine, my productivity completely changed. I was writing every single day, and I was making a lot more progress on my book over the course of a week in terms of word count and time spent on my novel. And besides that, having a writing routine has really helped me keep focus in writing. Before, when I was fitting it in whenever, I mentally wasn't really prepared to write, and I was always in sort of a frazzled state, and I wasn't very relaxed or ready to write. Now that I have a writing routine, I write at the same time every night. I even have a little pre-writing routine where I set up my space and mentally prepare for writing. And so by the time I sit down to write, it's really easy. My mind is focused. I'm already thinking about the book. I have nothing else going on in the background of my mind. And it's just so much easier for me to write. And like I said, this goes hand in hand with the writing practice, because if I could do this over, I would set up the writing routine when I started a writing practice. So I would do my writing practice the same time every day, and that would have really set me up for success. I wouldn't have wasted as much time as I did on draft 1, and I would have been doing a writing practice and been getting better at my writing. Another mistake that I made was spending way too long on the brainstorming, outlining, and plotting of my book before I started writing draft 1. I spent 6 months brainstorming, outlining, and plotting this book, and it was way too much. And the reason it was way too much is because what I was brainstorming, outlining, and plotting was not the most important parts of the story. I was totally focused on making this bulletproof, perfect story before I sat down to write draft 1. So I was trying to analyze my story for every little plot hole, and I appreciate myself trying to fix all the problems in my book, but that kept me from writing. I was so focused on tidying up all the details that I was spending more time doing that than working on the actual story and the characters. And I also just wasted a ton of time. I really think in retrospect, I could have maybe spent 2 or 3 months doing the brainstorming and outlining and plotting, but instead I spent 6. As a result, my first draft started a lot later than it should have, and it's just sort of wasted time. I think there's a big theme through everything that I wish I had done differently, and that is I wasted a lot of time. Unfortunately, when you're writing a book with no experience, you don't know that at the time, but that's what happened. And the other mistake I kind of made trying to prepare for this perfect first draft was thinking that I had to have all the ideas and that this is what it would be for the rest of the story. And in reality, I came up with a ton of great ideas while I was writing. My story really doesn't look anything like it did in the beginning. And in fact, I trashed my entire draft 1. So I spent 6 months working on draft 1 and I ended up trashing it. And what that experience really taught me was draft 1 is for getting the story out. And I shouldn't have tried to make everything perfect because everything ended up changing. I should be more worried about perfection in the later drafts as opposed to the earlier drafts. The next thing that I wish I had done differently, which I have recently learned, is I have rushed through the revision process too much and I have not taken it seriously. So I've had 2 revisions in between drafts 1 and 2 and in between drafts 2 and 3. And what I did during that time was I sat down with a notebook and I read my book and I took a few notes. Honestly, wasn't much more than a page. And then I said, okay, these are the things that I've got to fix. I'll do that in the next draft. And that was it. And my revision process only took like 3 or 4 days. And at the time, I thought that was sufficient. I was reading my book, I was taking notes. What I've learned now is that was not sufficient. I really noticed this as I was writing draft 3. I felt like my novel, though it was improving, was still having some of the same problems it's had for the last 3 drafts. And I wasn't really coming closer to finding a solution for these problems. And when I sat back and thought about why am I continuing to write this book with the same problems over and over, the reality for me was the problem lies in my revision process. I'm not doing a good job with revisions. And primarily the issue I was having was I was not analyzing enough. I was reading the story from the perspective of a reader and then writing down anything that came across from the perspective of a reader. And I wasn't really looking at it from the perspective of a writer or an editor. I wasn't paying too much attention to character arcs and story arcs and the progression of these and how that tracked in like the time frame. And I think my revision process, the 2 that I've had so far, were really wasted opportunities. I didn't really sit down to troubleshoot my novel. I just said, okay, this draft sucked. I'm gonna do a new one. I'm gonna make the new one better, and that's that. But I didn't really come up with a plan as to how to make it better. And I think that's where things kind of really went downhill in terms of my revision process. And that leads me into the next thing that I wish I had done differently, which is planning my drafts and having expectations for them. Like I said, I would just make notes and go into the next draft with the mindset of this draft is going to be better and I need to make it better. This has led to a very disjointed approach to my drafts where I'm just working on random things. And yes, my drafts have improved over time, but I truly feel like it's been baby step improvements. And what I really need at this point is like a leap of improvement. What I really should have done is planned out my drafts. Like, what is the purpose of the draft? What am I focusing on in the draft? I can get all the information from my improved revision process and then come up with a really solid plan for improving my next draft. For example, maybe draft 4 will be about the story. Maybe it will be about the characters. Maybe in draft 6 or 7, I approach line editing. In my last draft, I did everything. I worked on the story, I worked on the characters, I worked on the magic system. I line edited after I wrote a chapter, which it was good experience for me, but in hindsight, I should not have done all this stuff in one draft. It was too much to focus on, and as a result, I only touched on bits and pieces of things that need improvement instead of fixing things completely. This is definitely something I'm going to do for draft 4. I'm going to do a really thorough revision process. I'm going to come up with a plan for everything that needs fixing in my draft. It will probably be like a chapter by chapter breakdown, or at the very least, a progression sequence that I need to see where to put in the chapters, and go into the next draft with an expectation of this is what I'm going to fix, and then have on the other hand, this is how I plan on fixing it. Now let's talk about outlining and plotting. This is something I have recently learned, as in like 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it was definitely a surprise. And that is, I wish I had tried outlining, like really intense outlining, a lot earlier in this process. Of course, when I started this novel, I did not know if I was more of a pantser, which is flying by the seat of your pants and coming up with things off the top of your head, or a plotter, which is coming up with like a very detailed plot and outline and sequence of events and knowing exactly what's going to happen in the story. I tried a few different ways, but when I hadn't written before, it was hard to know how I worked best. And unfortunately, there's only one way to learn that, and that's to do it. And what I think happened in my case was I discovered very early on in draft 1 that I came up with a lot of my best ideas while I was writing. And because of that, I classified myself as a pantser. The problem here is, because I classified myself as a pantser, I didn't even really consider that maybe I should be doing plotting too. The debate between pantser and plotter is very contested, and I think it's important to realize that you can have elements of both. I have certainly realized that I'm probably both. And the way I realized that is because in my last draft, I wrote a complete chapter outline, and it was very, very detailed. And I will stick that video link in the description box. When I was going to write this chapter, I decided to do a very, very detailed outline. It was like 20 to 30 lines, and it was like a sequence by sequence, like this person talks about this, then this person talks about that, then this person goes here, then this person does this. Very, very detailed. And when I sat down to write it, it was so much easier to write that chapter than when I tried to pants a chapter. When I try to pants a chapter, I have 1 or 2 sentences in my chapter by chapter outline, and it basically says, in this chapter, XYZ happens. And then I write an entire chapter based off that. In the past, I never really thought it was a problem. I had noticed that there were times where I'd get stuck, maybe for 10 or 15 minutes, not tons of time, but I wouldn't know either how to start the chapter, or I'd write a section of the chapter and then I wasn't sure how to continue, and I would spend a lot of time thinking about that. But because I had this outline, I knew exactly what was happening next, and if I got stuck, I would just go back to my chapter outline that was very detailed, and literally the next thing I had to say was right there, and I was like, oh yeah, and then I would go back and write it. Because of this very detailed outline, I feel like I made a lot more progress than I do pantsing a chapter. And the funny part was I ended up pantsing during this exercise anyway. I came up with an idea that made the scene better. So I just incorporated that. But overall, I found the process to be a lot easier for me. And I think it made my writing better, and it made a difference in my writing process. And I just wish I had tried a complete outlining method of my story over a year ago, because it makes me wonder how much more progress I would have made in terms of time saved. But then I also wonder how much improvement I would have had in my writing process. I just don't know what that would look like because I haven't had time to implement that yet or try it. But it is something I am going to look at doing in the future, is doing a more stringent outline and seeing if that makes a difference in writing my books. And the last thing I wish I had done differently was not put too much pressure on myself and give myself more grace. Very early in the writing process, I kept getting burned out. I remember getting burned out 1 month, and then a few months later I would get burned out again, and it was hard. I had a full-time job, I was writing, I was doing YouTube, I had hobbies and social engagements, and it's hard to find time to do all that stuff. And I think the reason I was getting burned out on writing is because I was putting pressure on myself to complete it quickly. I have found this to be the case even more now that essentially writing is my full-time job. On a daily basis, I struggle with that writing life balance that I had talked about in the previous video. I put a lot of pressure on myself to take advantage of this time and write as much as possible and get as much done as quickly as possible because the writing process takes so long, and I just feel like I'm chasing this thing and it's so far away, and the more I work on it now, the sooner it's gonna happen. And because of that, I've sacrificed a lot of things. I've worked really, really hard. And just recently, I've decided to kind of relax a little bit on my writing, not in a sense where I'm going to goof off and not write, but maybe this looks like writing for a little less time during the day, or giving myself breaks more often. And so I need to really look at, am I burning myself out? Am I stressing myself out? There has been a lot of stress associated with my writing recently, and it's taken a little bit of the fun away from it, honestly, because I stress about, oh, I have so much left to do, I have so much work, I don't know how to make this better. What I've really come to understand is that this is such a long process. I really cannot control the length of the publishing process. I can control it in terms of how much I write. But if I'm writing every day, I'm doing enough. If I'm writing until I'm tired, I'm doing enough. Like, there's no reason for me to force myself to write and to make myself write beyond my capabilities, because the publishing process takes so long that what little extra I do isn't really gonna make a huge difference. Like, I'm not gonna fast forward this time frame by a year. So I might as well relax a tiny bit and enjoy my life a little more, be a little less stressed. As long as I am consistently writing and I'm happy with the progress I'm making and I'm making good personal progress, there's no reason to stress about this. And I'm kind of just along for the ride, right? I'm writing, I'm happy doing my writing, I love writing, and I need to stop letting this thing that's happening 2 or 3 years in the future, like, from controlling my life right now. This is something I've dealt with over time, but in different forms. And, there's a work-life balance aspect to it, but then also I think it's just a mental thing where I really need to be satisfied with what I'm doing and allow myself the ability to take my time with my writing. This is just a handful of things that I wish I had done differently in starting my book, and I still have months and years of this book left, and so I'm sure I will come up with even more things over time. I'm really grateful for all my new followers and everyone who supported my last video and this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next writing video.